Hello, everybody, and welcome to the Sunday live stream here on Adam's Music Box. I hope everyone out there is doing well. Well, today I wanted to talk first about this thing called oldies. We've all heard the term, we all probably associate certain genres of music with the word, but what does it mean and where did it come from? Well, everything that happened yesterday is older than what's happening today. And when today becomes tomorrow, today's yesterday becomes older than it was before. Say that 3 times and try doing it sober for a change. But seriously, oldies are the things that are old. But naturally, this would mean that once music hits a certain age, like a fine wine, it would be transferred from the rock section or the rap section or the soul section or the whatever section to the oldie section. But this isn't typically the case. And to understand why that is, we have to look at the origins of the word oldies insofar as it applies to musical programming on the radio and elsewhere. And the term really started to come into play first in the 70s, and it remained so well into the 80s, 90s, and you still hear it a lot today. Now, what did it signify? Well, in musical terms, it signified the rock and R&B of the 50s into the early 60s, and very occasionally into the mid 60s. This was sort of the rock before everything changed in the late 60s, before psychedelia, before prog rock, before hard rock, before the hippie movement, before the war in Vietnam captured the attention of the rock and roll and the soul and even elements of the gospel world. It was really the Beatles before they had long hair, right back through Elvis, through Bill Haley, Chuck Berry, the Big Bopper, Richie Valens, Buddy Holly, that type of music. Doo-wop, for instance, Gene Chandler, one of the great people. Remember, Duke, 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 Duke of O, Duke, Duke, one of my favorite songs. So that was oldies. And in the 70s, people came to really like it. There was a kind of revival of that music of the 50s and very early 60s. And I think that happened for reasons that were almost more sociological than musical. To get the music out of the way on this music show, the music was really good. It's hard to dislike doo-wop. It's hard to dislike early rock and roll. You could dance to it. The lyrics were fun. The musical style was accessible and generally inoffensive to those who had grown up around it. The earlier generations had different views on it, calling it radical. But if you grew up around it, it seemed really tame and inoffensive by comparison to the music of the late 60s and 70s, which was much harder and more serious in many ways. And so there was that. But let's look at what sociological developments were going on in the early 70s that made people want to retreat back into this world of oldies. Well, the 50s was a decade of socioeconomic stability. There were things brewing below the surface. There always are. Brown versus Board of Education, that was in the 50s. The Korean War, that was in the 50s. The French exit from what they called Indochina and what was later called Vietnam in the 50s. But the 50s was also an age of hitherto unknown prosperity. The middle class, particularly in the United States and some of its allies, had grown bigger than any burger or middling or middle class or gentry class even in the history of the world. Things were pretty good for a majority of people. There were certainly pockets of poverty and despair. There were racial issues, but on the whole, things were better than they had been for almost everyone, which isn't that hard to do when you have come from decades of depression and war, and now you're in the decade of the space age of inexpensive but well-built Chevrolets, hi-fi systems starting to come in because you have the advent of stereo. Everyone has a television, a refrigerator, and air conditioning. All the stuff we have today, only now it's less reliable, and a lot of it, when adjusted for inflation, has become more expensive. So that was the sociology of the 50s. And there was a general in the White House for much of the decade whose reputation was really beyond all impeachment. what was happening in the early 70s by comparison? Well, the Vietnam War was lost in all but name. Cambodia was being bombed. The country, the United States, went off the gold standard in 1971, in August of 1971, no less. So we're coming up on that very scary anniversary. As the Nixon administration wore on, people's views of him changed, and he began being associated with corruption and trickery, Tricky Dicky, and the rest of it. After 1973, because of the existence of the petrodollar and its relationship to American foreign policy and wars between several Arab nations and Israel, there was a gas embargo, an oil embargo, and that made the gas prices, the petrol prices, call it what you will, go up. And this led to cars being made less fun because they started to impose what they called the cafe standards, which made fast cars into slow cars. Not much fun. Inflation was coming out. Remember the song? What was it by PT Express? Inflation through the nation, heading for salvation. It was being talked about. And so it was a time of uncertainty. The Church Committee, for example, in 1975, blew the lid open on what the CIA and FBI were doing, things that most people didn't like because most people thought that these were bad things, COINTELPRO, MK Ultra, these types of things. And we began for the first time to know that the people who considered themselves oh so trustworthy weren't very trustworthy. And then, of course, we went backwards after that revelation in the mid 70s. But for a while, it was all about people longing for stability. And the 50s culture, the music, the cars, the clothing, it tended to represent stability. And there were plenty of artistic moves being made in the very late 60s and into the 70s, especially, that really harkened back to the 50s. Now, one of the reasons this was possible is because of all of those new genres and subgenres of music that came out in the late 60s that made it very easy for programmers on the radio and elsewhere to make a clear delineation between the doo-wop and the early rock and roll stuff to the stuff in the late 60s and into the 70s. In 1959, you had things like Take Good Care of My Baby, you had Bobby Darin, you had Frankie Avalon. In 1969, you had bands like King Crimson talking about innocence raped by napalm fire. And that was just the first song on the album. We've come a long way from Take Good Care of My Baby, haven't we? And so there was this clear line in the sand. We've gone from I Want to Hold Your Hand to Helter Skelter. And no one who committed a murder at the head of a cult, who himself was brainwashed by the CIA, was ever threatening anyone by referencing I Want to Hold Your Hand. So even the biggest band of the decade, they changed from the beginning of the decade till the end of the decade. And so it was very easy to sort of draw an artificial line in the sand between the good old days and the heady days of today, the late 60s and the 70s. And people will always be nostalgia for certain things that remind them of more stable times. And as I said, a lot of artists stepped in to fill this void. First and foremost, there was Sha Na Na, who formed in the late 60s, and they were at Woodstock alongside Jimi Hendrix and Jefferson Airplane and Santana and Joe Cocker and The Who and all of the bands doing really contemporary stuff at the time. And here these guys were with slick back hair and leather and dungarees, singing doo-wop style music. And they went from strength to strength in the 70s. People loved Sha Na Na. Then you had George Lucas's breakthrough film American Graffiti, which was sort of like Rebel Without a Cause, but instead of a film that was contemporary, because Rebel Without a Cause was about feral youth in the 50s, it showed the underbelly of the calm, stable middle-class America. American Graffiti was almost like a positive nostalgia trip, looking back at the 50s from the prism of very groovy and far-out people in the 70s. Then later in the decade, you have Grease, which just turned the whole concept of being in school in the 1950s into a musical, one of the most popular of all time. So people were 50s crazy in the 70s, and people really wanted that nostalgia trip. And this is also when oldies radio stations began to populate the radio dial. And this trend continued strongly into the 80s, even though time was moving forward, and into the 90s. Even in the early 2000s, there was this oldies format. But in general, the programming, the kinds of music remained in the 50s and early 60s. So the question is, if by the 90s, the early 70s was old, why didn't it become oldies? And I think the reason has been answered by talking about this clear line in the sand. Music changed more significantly between 1959 and 1969 than it did between 1969 and 1979, 1979 and 1989, 1989 and the year 2000. Because the changes were not only profoundly different in terms of musical style, but in sociology. And let's talk about how stylistically things changed. A lot of this changed because of technology. Amplifiers got bigger, more reliable, and louder. Guitar effects became much more prominent by the end of the 60s and into the 70s. The amount of new keyboard instruments that people had access to had grown immensely. In the late 50s, synthesizers were either things that Stockhausen was working on at university laboratories. By the end of the 60s, you could buy yourself a synthesizer. They weren't very cheap, although they became cheaper, but they appeared on popular music. Abbey Road by the Beatles, full of Moog synthesizers. Switched on Bach from the end of the 60s, the album by Wendy Carlos, Walter at the time, who introduced the Moog to the world. Things like the Mellotron on Moody Blues albums, King Crimson albums. So music got more diverse in terms of the sound palette. You could afford to do more than a clean guitar sound, clean bass sound, and a small drum set. The drum sets got bigger, the amplifiers got bigger, the keyboard sounds got more diverse, the guitar sounds got more diverse. So with all of these things, this just added on to the differences between the 50s and the end of the 60s. And that's why I think for a long time, oldies have remained one thing in the eyes of the world. So much so that a few years back, when people realized, well, the 70s are now older from the context of the year 2010 than the 50s were when people were being nostalgic about them in 1972 and 3. So what are we going to do? For the last 50 years now, I'm talking from the perspective of a man in 2010, for the last 50 years or so, oldies has only meant one thing. We're going to have to come up with a new word. And the word that they chose was classic hits. And that's sometimes referred to as music of the 60s, 70s, 80s, 90s, and today, which basically means everything older than the last few months. But when you go to a record shop or when you type in a Spotify playlist and write oldies, 8 times out of 10, if not 9 times out of 10, you are going to get music from the shoot up, do up, do up, do up era, as opposed to, Prince singing about Darling Nikki masturbating with the magazine. That's a reference from yesterday's show, by the way. We were talking about censorship in music. I think you get the point now. Let me see if I can do something about this light behind me. I don't know if I can. I think I might have made it worse, but that's okay because it's not about the vision, it's about the sound, man. So I want to talk about 2 keyboardists who sometimes don't get mentioned in the pantheon of sort of rock and rock adjacent keyboardists the way that, let's say, the great Rick Wakeman or the late great Keith Emerson do. And this is Rick Wright of Pink Floyd and some other things we'll talk about, and Vangelis. Now, Vangelis was very popular and remains popular. But again, not mentioned in those same sentences, possibly because of his approach to composition being very different. But he was definitely a pioneer and came from a similar era. His most well-known stuff is quite possibly the soundtracks he did, things like Blade Runner and Chariots of Fire, among many others. He even did some stuff that was borderline ambient music in the mid-70s, but always with a strong attention to a melody embedded in these really eerie and interesting yet comforting chords. And this, I think, explains why he's so popular throughout the world. But before he struck out in the mid 70s as a solo artist, he was in one of the coolest psychedelic rock bands from a country that you don't necessarily associate with psychedelic rock. Now, Greek music is a music unto itself, Greek folk music. It's quite possibly my favorite folk music in the world. It's got instruments that tend to be very unique either to the Hellenic region or to Greece itself, the bouzouki being the most well known. I was listening to this traditional Greek music just today. And it's not a country that's known for exporting pop music the way that English speaking countries have, or even, let's say, France and Spain have to a large degree. Think people like Serge Gainsbourg, Edith Piaf, many others from France. Think people like Julio Iglesias, who conquered the world. From Spain, no conquistador he, that would have been Gary Brooker of Procol Harum. But Aphrodite's Child were a band that defied that trend, and they had some really, really good singles. It's 5 o'clock. Listen to that one. I Want to Live. Listen to that one. So many great stuff. End of the World. Wonderful. Rain and Tears. Wonderful. And one of the reasons that the band was so successful is it combined the rich sense of songwriting and chordality that Vangelis has always been known for with the wonderful vocals of Dimis Roussos, who went on to become a huge star in his own right, mainly in Europe, but he did have some international hits. He sung most of his stuff in English in terms of the international hits, but obviously some in his native Greek. And he was a character. He, like Vangelis, is sadly no longer with us, but his vocal range was great, wonderfully strong falsetto, but also very strong in the lower ranges. And somewhere in the early 70s, Aphrodite's Child decided to transition from a kind of psychedelic group that was writing a lot of sort of 3-minute singles to not only a prog rock band, but a prog rock band that did one of the most ambitious double albums of all time. And this was before Tales from Topographic Oceans by Yes. And this was an album that was released in 72, and the album was called 666. And the album is all about the biblical book of Revelation, the book which it's not real. It's kind of about the end of the world, but it's more about how people living in a world consumed by sin will face judgment. That's my best way to describe the book of Revelation to an audience that may or may not be familiar with it. And so the album is a retelling, a loose retelling, albeit, of the book of Revelation, but it's done in a style that is just, it's quintessentially Greek. It's just different. Yet it's quintessentially prog rock on the one hand, but quintessentially Greek on the other. The band weren't in Greece at the time. In 1967, there was a political change in Greece where a regime called the regime of the Colonels took over. And so the band recorded this mainly in France, but they also did a lot of work in London, England. But you can take the Greek out of the Greek islands, but you can't, you know how the saying goes. And to this day, it's considered a true classic by prog heads throughout the world because it's just so different. It's produced really interestingly. It references elements of traditional Greek mythology. It has biblical references. It has references that don't make any sense at all. It's simply a marvelous and very interesting, very spiritual album. So I highly recommend that. And there was even a story told that, speaking of Rick Wakeman, who we mentioned earlier, Vangelis was on the verge of replacing Rick Wakeman in Yes, because Rick left the band after the recently mentioned Tales from Topographic Oceans. He was drinking beers and eating a chicken curry in the middle of the concerts. He did not like that album. Steve Howe, the great guitarist, did, but Rick did not. So he temporarily left the band. And Yes was clearly in the market for continental European keyboard players because they talked to Vangelis, who didn't turn out to be the right fit. And then they settled on Patrick Moraz, who had replaced Keith Emerson in his band, The Nice. They changed the name to Refugees from The Nice, get it? And then he joined Yes and brought a wonderfully different sound into the band. I think his work on the Relayer album with Yes, this is Patrick Moraz, that is, that we're talking about, was really, really good. But I can imagine it being even more far out if you had Vangelis on there, because, well, Moraz replaced Keith Emerson because both had a great sense of speed and both had some subtle but profound jazz influences. Vangelis, with his influences on a combination that derived from a combination of traditional Greek music to the sense of sort of very futuristic chordal music, would have been so interesting. Because if I had to name a genre for Vangelis, I would say that it was futuristic music. You listen to his albums like Spiral, what an album that is. And it sounds like something that has yet to be made, Cosmic Man. It really has that feeling. Definitely check that album out. Check out all of Vangelis' 70s stuff, because it's all very far out and it all sounds like something that is yet to come. And this is because he used synthesizers in a very different way from others. So check out Aphrodite's Child. Also check out the wonderful solo material of Vangelis. Now, another great keyboard player I want to talk about is Richard Wright. Now, Rick Wright was in one of the most famous bands of all time, Pink Floyd. And I did a video before where I said that he was really central to the sound of Pink Floyd, not really given the credit he deserves for making Pink Floyd sound the way they did. Obviously, Roger was the creative force in terms of the composition, the lyrics, the concept. What is Pink Floyd without the concepts? The philosophy, the stage design, the visual elements that accompany the music. That was Roger. David was that smooth voice and that wonderful guitar. But what truly gave them the sound that was instantly recognizable as Pink Floyd, right from Piper at the Gates of Dawn through to Animals, which was the last Pink Floyd album that Rick had a lot of hands-on creative input in. By The Wall, he was being pushed to the side. But I would say for that classic era of Pink Floyd, it was his keyboards, because it would be hard to find a more tasteful keyboard player. He didn't do wildly fast solos. He did do solos. Check out the second side of the Wish You Were Here album, the end of Shine On You Crazy Diamond. But even his solos, they were all about chords. And he was very much influenced by Bill Evans and his modal jazz playing. And what Rick was able to do was combine some of the essential elements of modal jazz playing with the textures and directness of psychedelia. And when you put that together, you get Rick Wright. And I think that his keyboard playing really, really should be seen as an equally important part to the sound of Pink Floyd as was the stuff that Gilmour and Roger Waters did. Now, Rick did something in the early 80s that I think you all need to listen to. And to explain what this is, we need to talk about fashion, not as in the shirt off your back, Jack, but in the sense of the band Fashion. Now, Fashion was one of these bands with three different lineups that had very little to do with each other. It originally formed in the late 70s as a sort of a semi-obscure post-punk band, but by 1982 a new lineup had come in, and this was under the guise of a vocalist, guitarist, and songwriter Dave Harris, who on the album was credited as D Harris. D-double-E Harris, but it was Dave. But I guess when you're in a band called Fashion, D sounds a bit cooler than, Dave from, my friend Dave from next door. But Dave Harris was a great songwriter, still is. Great guitar player, very moody. He really knew his way around a synthesizer. And he collaborated with a very sort of future-minded German producer who did a lot of experimental synth and dance music. And he was called Zeus Beheld. See, the Greek references, you can't get away from them. So you had Dave D. Harris and Zeus Beheld creating an album called Fabrique by the band Fashion. Now, this album has been released and remastered on several compact discs. Dave did a remaster a few years back, but it is still not on your streaming services. I'll double check right now for you. But it doesn't seem as though it is. And that's a real shame, because it could be licensing problems. For some reason, a single song from the album, Love Shadow, is on Spotify, but the album Fabrique is not. So check out Discogs, YouTube if you must, do what you need to do. check that album out because it's really a unique album. It would be too easy to pigeonhole it into the kind of early 80s synth pop of the time, the Duran Duran's, early Talk Talk, Flock of Seagulls, Thompson Twins. But there's something different about it. It had a level of stylistic, dare I say, sophistication that really made it a kind of album of, I'll put it this way. If the Rat Pack were born a few decades later and decided to form a synth pop band, it may have been that. It was the kind of album you dress up for. And they really played that up. That's why they really were playing up on the name Fashion. I think that on the early pressings, if you filled in a little card that came on the album, they'd give you a free camera by Olympus. So it was the whole thing. And it was just such a unique album. And that really was down to Dave's sound. Now, Dave left Fashion shortly thereafter, and they went on to make another album called Twilight of the Idols, a very much a Wagnerian name there, or a Nietzschean name rather, because that was Nietzsche's take on Wagner. Wagner was Goethe Dämmerung, and Nietzsche was Goetze Dämmerung. So Twilight of the Gods versus Twilight of the Idols. I'm sure I've lost the whole audience now, but we continue, we persevere. And we'll get out of the jungle that Axl Rose has welcomed us into. So Dave was looking for someone to collaborate with, and Rick Wright had been kicked out of Pink Floyd, quite unfairly in my view, but they found each other, and they formed a band called ZEE or ZWE, the ZWE, depending on which side of the tongue you decide to twist. And their album was called Identity. It was the lone album that this collaborative project did together. But what an album! The album was all focused on an instrument that was still very new in the early 80s, and it was very expensive. And this instrument was called the Fairlight CMI, the first ever keyboard-based sampling instrument. And the vast majority of sounds you are hearing on this album are either created in or created by the Fairlight CMI. There's very little other instrumentation on the album. And it really, really is great. The voices between the two of them, they blend well together. Dave takes the lead vocals, Rick does the BV, the backing vocals, and it really just goes so well together. Now, this album, fortunately, is on Spotify, unlike the Fashion album. And you can find it, they've listed it in a way that so they list it under Richard Wright and Dave Harris rather than Z. And I can understand why they've done that, because the band's name Z sort of faded into obscurity shortly after the album was released. The record labels didn't promote it enough. It could have and should have been really big. It was super experimental, yet really good songwriting. And there's that classic chordality of Rick Wright that you've come to know, love, and expect from listening to Pink Floyd. But luckily, if you type in either Dave Harris or Richard Wright, you will find it on Spotify. And I think of all of the sort of obscure albums of the 80s, this is really one of the best. You will not be disappointed in it. So definitely check that out. Check out Aphrodite's Child and tell me, what do you think of when you hear the word oldies? Just to, I think, as the kids say, to circle back to where we began. Second verse, same as the first. I'm Henry the Eighth, I am, but which is ironically a song played on oldie stations. And we talked about Herman's Hermits and Peter Noon a few shows back. What a nice guy he is. And I actually really like Herman's Hermits. Really good music. So check out all of the stuff that we talked about today. And keep on listening. This is obviously a new-ish channel. We're in the growth stages. So liking, subscribing, and sharing is something very helpful to me. And if you enjoyed what you heard today, it might even be helpful to you and those you like. Share it with someone you don't like and pester them. I don't care. I'll get the views, and that's one small step closer to where we need to be. Like, subscribe. We'll see you next time. Take care.